The Chicago night wind cut through every alley like a blade, and a thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks in a cold, lifeless white, while the Bluespin laundromat in the poor neighborhood on the south side of the city was the only place still lit against all that silence. Inside, a 27-year-old woman with dark brown hair tied neatly back was folding the last load of laundry with cracked hands, her face thin but beautiful in a sorrowful way, her eyes exhausted, and yet still holding a quiet gentleness. Not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know any other way to survive. Her name was Brielle, and 2 hours earlier, she had just been fired for secretly taking leftover food home for her 7-year-old little sister, who was lying in the hospital with heart disease. She took off her apron, shoved it into her locker for the last time, and then stepped out into the night, with no heavy coat, no money, and no idea what tomorrow would bring, carrying only the hospital message on her phone, reminding her that her little sister's medical bill was already 10 days overdue. She walked 2 city blocks in silence, her breath turning to white smoke, until she saw him, an old man sitting on a bus stop bench, where the buses had stopped running long ago, wearing only a thin shirt in the winter night, slippers on his feet, staring at an old photograph in his hand, as though he clearly couldn't remember who the person in it was anymore. Brielle walked past him, stopped, and then turned back, because the image of her mother lying in the street for 3 hours while no one stopped has never allowed her to keep walking. She sat down beside him on that bench, 2 strangers in the freezing night, and the old man handed her the photograph, as if asking her to help him find the woman in it, a beautiful woman yellowed by time. But Brielle didn't know that the trembling old man beside her was the father of the most dangerous Mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire underworld called the Quiet Devil, and tonight, that man was searching for his father. She also didn't know that the moment she chose to sit down on that bench instead of walking away, the moment any other person would have ignored, would pull her into a world of gunfire, betrayal, and secrets powerful enough to destroy everything she was trying to protect. But that same moment would also bring her the one thing that 27 years of life had never given her, a real home. If you want to know what happens when the Quiet Devil finds the girl who saved his father, hit like to support this story. Share this video with someone you know won't give up halfway through, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Because what happens after that night is when everything truly begins. The ambulance pulled away, its red lights dimming at the far end of the street, and Brielle was left standing alone on the sidewalk, her legs numb with cold, her breath ghosting in the frigid air of the Chicago winter night. She looked down at her hands and realized she was still holding the old photograph the elderly man had given her, the picture of a beautiful woman, aged with a sepia tint, one corner slightly bent because she had unconsciously gripped it too tightly for more than an hour out there in the freezing air. She had forgotten to give it back, and now they were gone. Brielle stood there a little longer, staring down the empty street, then carefully slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of her coat, close to her heart, as though she were safeguarding something precious for someone else, something she didn't understand and didn't know why it had been entrusted to her. Then she began the walk home, each step heavier than the one before, not because of the cold, but because now, with the old man safely taken away, with no one left for her to worry about except herself, everything she had tried not to think about all night came crashing down on her at once. She had lost her job. She didn't have the money for next month's rent, and her little sister was lying in a hospital bed with a medical bill 10 days overdue, and Brielle had no idea where the money would come from. She turned into the familiar alley, climbed 3 flights of dark stairs that smelled of dampness and old neglect, and unlocked the door to the tiny studio apartment she called home. The room was nearly as cold as the street outside because she had turned off the heat the week before to save money. There was almost nothing in it worth mentioning. A narrow bed with white sheets gone gray with time, a small table with one leg that wobbled slightly, and an old refrigerator humming in the corner, nearly empty inside. She set the old man's photograph on the table, propped it gently against the wall, then sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the woman's face in the picture, as though she were searching there for the answer to a question she didn't know how to put into words. The phone in her pocket began to vibrate. She took it out, looked at the screen, and felt everything inside her sink. A message from the finance department at St. Catherine Hospital. The wording was brief and cold, as it always was. Penny Ashford's medical bill was overdue, and payment was required within 7 days, or the account would be transferred to collections. Brielle read the message 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because she was trying to find some way for those words not to be true. But they were true. They were always true. She placed the phone face down on the bed, as though not seeing it might make it disappear, then closed her eyes, and memory pulled her back to the week before, to the hospital room on the 3rd floor, to the pale white light, and Penny lying there, so small, so pale, her eyes too large for her thin face, looking at Brielle with a gaze no 7-year-old child should ever have. Too old, too understanding, too used to seeing her sister worn down with exhaustion. Penny had asked her that day, in a voice so soft it was as if she were afraid the question itself might make things harder. "Are you very tired, Brielle?" And Brielle had smiled. The smile she practiced every day before stepping into that hospital room. The smile she knew didn't fool Penny, and yet still wore because she didn't know what else to do except smile. And she had said, "I'm not tired. I'm fine. Don't worry about me." But now, in the dark room, alone, with no one left to pretend strength for, Brielle lowered her head into her hands and cried. Not loudly, because she had forgotten long ago how to cry out loud, but in that silent way where tears slip through the spaces between your fingers and fall onto your knees, onto the cold floor, as though her body were wringing out the last of whatever had survived a day in which she lost her job, saved a stranger, and still couldn't find a way to keep her sister alive. The photograph of the unknown woman still stood on the table, the face in it smiling gently beneath the streetlight filtering through the thin curtain, as though she were looking at Brielle, as though she were trying to tell her that she wasn't alone, even while everything around her was saying the opposite. Brielle lifted her head, looked at the photograph with red, swollen eyes, and whispered into the empty room, her voice hoarse and fragile as if it might break apart. "I'll find a way to return you to him." She didn't know why those words mattered so much to her when the rest of her life was falling apart. Maybe it was because, in a night when she had lost almost everything, keeping a promise to a lost old man was the only thing she still had the power to control. She wiped her tears away with the back of her worn, calloused hand, pulled the thin blanket over herself, and lay down in the darkness, her eyes still open, staring up at the peeling ceiling, listening to the hum of the neighbor's heater through the thin wall, and she wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, how many more nights she could endure before everything truly gave way at last. At that same moment, on the far side of the city, a phone began to vibrate in the darkness of a study buried deep inside the Moretti estate, and Cale Moretti, the man the entire Chicago underworld called the Quiet Devil, picked it up before the second ring could sound. Priest was on the other end, his voice as flat and steady as always, but the rhythm of his speech was a little faster than usual, just enough for Kyle to know this wasn't an ordinary call, and it took only 4 words: Enzo, hospital, Staint, Catherine. Cale rose from his chair, not in haste but without delay, every movement precise in the way of a man who had grown used to receiving bad news at any hour of the day or night. He put on a dark coat, with no expensive watch, and nothing showy about him, and walked down the long corridor, where 2 guards nodded as he passed, and neither one dared look him directly in the eye. The black SUV was already running at the gate, Priest was in the driver's seat, and on the way to the hospital, Cale asked no further questions, because he already knew what had happened. His father had slipped away from his watch again, had wandered out into the winter night again with a mind slowly erasing everything that had once made him who he was, and this was the 3rd time in the month. When Cale stepped into the emergency room, a young doctor was waiting for him, his face showing the strain of a man who had just been informed that the homeless patient they had admitted actually had a son whom no one in this city wanted to offend. The doctor spoke quickly, professionally, though he stumbled slightly at the beginning. Mr. Enzo had been brought in with mild hypothermia. He was stable now, asleep, and had no serious injuries. Then the doctor stopped, looked at Cale, and added one more detail that he quite clearly considered more important than any medical reading. A young woman had stayed beside Mr. Enzo for more than an hour out in the freezing cold before calling for an ambulance. She had wrapped something warm around him, sat beside him on the bench, talked to him even though he barely responded, and when the ambulance arrived, she had no coat, her lips were blue, her hands were shaking, and she quite obviously needed treatment herself, but she refused to get in. She only stood there watching until the ambulance drove away. If it hadn't been for her, the doctor said, his voice slowing on the final words to make sure Cale heard them clearly, he wouldn't have made it through the night. Cale didn't react outwardly. His face remained like stone, but his jaw tightened so hard that the muscle at his temple flickered, and he stepped past the doctor and went straight into the room. Enzo lay there on a white bed, beneath a hospital blanket, far smaller than the man Cale remembered. A 72-year-old who had once built an empire with his own hands and his own will, now curled up like a lost child, his eyes closed, his breathing steady but thin. Cale pulled a chair to the bedside and looked at his father's face, and in that moment, all the power, all the fear his name inspired on the streets, all the things he had built, and all the things he had destroyed, became utterly meaningless before one simple truth. A strange young woman had sat beside his father for more than an hour in the cold, while he, the son, hadn't even known his father was gone until he received the call. The guilt didn't come loudly. It came quietly, like underground water that had been flowing beneath him for a long time while he refused to look down, and now it had risen all the way to his throat. Cale sat there for a long time, one hand resting on the edge of the bed, close to his father's hand but not touching it, as though he wasn't sure he still deserved to hold that hand. Then he stood, stepped out into the hallway, and said to Priest, who was leaning against the wall across from the room, in a low voice, no louder than a whisper, but carrying the full weight of an order that couldn't be challenged, "Find that girl. I want to know who she is." Priest nodded and walked away, and 15 minutes later he returned with the first piece of information, not from an investigation, but from the hospital's own security cameras. The girl had left the emergency entrance, but she hadn't left the hospital. The camera recorded her going straight up to the 3rd floor, to pediatrics, and entering the room of a patient named Penny Ashford, 7 years old, a long-term patient with congenital heart disease. Cale looked at the security image Priest handed him, the picture of a thin girl with dark brown hair, no coat, standing beside the bed of a small child, and he understood at once. She wasn't some passerby who had done a good deed by chance and then gone home to sleep peacefully. She had a war of her own. She had someone she needed to protect. She had reasons to be exhausted. And even so, she had still stopped for his father. It didn't move Cale in any ordinary way, because Cale wasn't an ordinary man, but it unsettled him, because in the world he lived in, no one gave without taking something in return, no one was kind without a purpose, and this girl was breaking every rule he had used to read people for 36 years. 2 days later, Priest placed a thin file on Cale's desk. Not many pages, because Brielle Ashford's life held nothing complicated enough to make it thick, only poverty, loss, and survival. Priest stood across from him, arms folded over his chest, and read the summary in the flat tone of a man reciting a weather report. Brielle Ashford, 27 years old, born in Chicago. Her mother died when she was 22. Her father, an alcoholic, had walked out 7 years ago, shortly after Penny was born. No one adopted her. She and Penny were forced into the Greer Foundation's transitional housing, where she fought to keep her sister safe from the age of 22 until they could survive on their own, then left to make her way on her own, doing every kind of work she could find, washing dishes, waiting tables, folding laundry at a laundromat. At present, she was working 3 jobs at once, and every dollar she earned went toward hospital bills and caring for her little sister. Penny Ashford, 7 years old, diagnosed with congenital heart disease, a long-term patient at St. Catherine. No criminal record, no arrest record, no bad debt because no one had ever trusted her with a loan. No ties to any organization or individual in the underworld. No meaningful friends except for a coworker named Orla Byrne at the laundromat where she had just been fired. Priest stopped at the end of the report, looked at Cale, and added one sentence he rarely attached to any report at all, because Priest wasn't a man who gave personal opinions. But this time he said, "She's clean. Cleaner than anyone we've ever checked." Cale sat motionless, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the desk in a slow, even rhythm, a habit he had whenever he was weighing something he hadn't yet found the angle to trust. He had already read the file before Priest entered the room. He had looked at the hospital security image more than once. He already knew every number and every fact in the life of this young woman, and everything pointed in the same direction. She truly was exactly what she appeared to be, a poor, orphaned, exhausted girl who had still sat in the freezing cold for more than an hour because of a strange old man. But Cale hadn't survived to 36 years old in this world by trusting what his eyes showed him. He had survived because he always searched for what the eye couldn't see, always assumed that behind every act of kindness there was a hidden purpose. Behind every smile there was calculation, and behind every outstretched hand there was always the possibility that it was holding a knife. That wasn't paranoia. That was experience. He had lost his wife because he trusted the wrong person. He had almost lost his father because he hadn't been careful enough. And now a girl had appeared out of nowhere, saved his father, asked for nothing, left no name, made no contact, as though kindness were something that came from her as naturally as breath, and that was exactly what left Cale uneasy. Because in his world, kindness without purpose was the most dangerous thing of all. Because he didn't know how to defend himself against it, didn't know where to place it in the map. He used to read every human being around him, and anything he couldn't read, he didn't trust. Cale stopped tapping his fingers, looked at Priest, and said, "Don't approach her yet. Keep watching." Priest nodded and asked no further questions, because he understood Cale better than anyone. Understood that when Cale said, "watch her," it didn't mean he suspected the girl of some dark intention. It meant he was suspicious of his own reaction, suspicious of that strange feeling he had when the doctor spoke about her, suspicious of why he had looked at the camera image more times than necessary, and Cale Moretti never acted until he understood exactly why he wanted to act. A week passed, and Brielle was still living each day as if she were walking a wire. The morning shift washing dishes at a small restaurant downtown, the afternoon shift serving at a cafe near the hospital so she could stop in to see Penny every evening, and then walking home at night because she couldn't afford the bus fare every day. That evening, she turned into the familiar shortcut alley 2 blocks from home, her legs aching with exhaustion after 14 hours of standing without rest, her head lowered, her eyes fixed on the sidewalk, and she almost walked right past without noticing if she hadn't heard the familiar murmur drifting back from the brick wall ahead. Brielle lifted her head and stopped at once. Enzo was standing in the middle of the alley, his back against the wall, his eyes lifted toward the sky as though he were reading something written on those old bricks that only he could see, his lips moving as he repeated the same name again and again, a name she had heard the first time but still didn't understand. Mabel. Where's Mabel? He was wearing a thinner shirt than before, slippers still on his feet, and Brielle didn't need anyone to tell her that he had gotten lost again, had slipped away from whoever was supposed to be watching him again, had wandered out into the Chicago winter night again, with a mind that was slowly forgetting the road back home. She walked toward him gently, without rushing, without startling him, and said in the same voice she used whenever Penny was frightened, "Sir, you've gone outside again." Enzo looked at her, and the strange thing happened for the second time. He smiled. Not the smile of someone who suddenly remembered her, but the smile of someone who felt something safe even if he couldn't name it, as though his body remembered her kindness even while his mind had forgotten. Brielle lightly took his hand, guided him to the nearby steps, and helped him sit down, then looked at the medical bracelet on his wrist, the one she hadn't been able to read in the darkness the first time. This time she read it clearly. Enzo Moretti, an emergency phone number, and in small print beneath it, Alzheimer's, early stage. She took out her phone, dialed the number on the bracelet, and waited. On the other end, a deep male voice answered after half a ring, not saying hello, only waiting in silence, and Brielle said, "I found Mr. Enzo Moretti. He's in the alley between Halsted and 47th. He's safe, but he needs someone to come get him." Priest said, 20 minutes, and hung up. Brielle sat beside Enzo quietly, holding his hand in hers so he wouldn't be afraid, and she told him about Penny just as she had the first time, not because he understood, but because the presence of a human voice was the only thing that could keep him calm. Exactly 20 minutes later, the headlights of a black SUV swept across the mouth of the alley, and a man stepped out of the back seat. Not Priest. Cale. He walked into the alley in a dark coat, his pace unhurried, but every step carried the weight of a man accustomed to controlling every space he entered. And when he came close enough to see clearly, he found exactly the scene he had spent the past week replaying through security images, but had never seen with his own eyes. The thin girl with dark brown hair, wearing no proper coat, sitting beside his father on the cold steps, her hand holding his, her mouth softly telling him something. Brielle looked up, saw him, and pulled back half a step on instinct. Not because she was afraid, but because her whole body had been trained since childhood to be wary whenever any strange man came too close in the dark. Cale stopped a few steps away, looked at his father, then at her, and asked in a voice he didn't realize he was using, a deeper voice, a slower one. Not the voice of command, but the voice of a man who truly wanted to understand. "The first time you met him, was it like this too?" Brielle nodded. "He was sitting out in the cold. I couldn't walk away. Silence stretched for a few seconds, with nothing but the wind and the sight of misty exhalations crystallizing in the dark. And then Brielle remembered the thing she had kept for an entire week. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat, pulled out the old photograph, a little more wrinkled now from resting close against her chest for so many days, and handed it to Cale. "He gave me this that night. I forgot to return it." Cale took the photograph, looked down, and everything inside him went still. The face in the picture was his father's wife, the stepmother he had loved as his own mother, the woman who had died 10 years earlier, and whom his father still carried in that photograph, even though he no longer remembered who she was. He looked at the worn photograph in his hand, looked at the bent corner where Brielle had unconsciously gripped it that first night, and he understood that she had kept it carefully, not because she knew how important it was, but simply because it belonged to an old man she believed needed help. Cale had to turn his face away for 1 second, his jaw tightening as he swallowed something down that he wouldn't allow to rise into expression. Then he turned back, looked at Brielle, and said, "He's my father. He has Alzheimer's. He keeps slipping outside because he can't remember where he is." Brielle looked at Enzo, then at Cale, and her eyes changed, not with dramatic shock, but with understanding. She understood why he wandered. She understood why he carried the photograph. And she understood that the man standing before her was in pain, because the way he looked at his father was exactly the way she looked at Penny every night, through the glass of her hospital room. Cale helped his father to his feet, one hand steadying Enzo by the elbow, the other resting lightly against his back, and guided him toward the SUV waiting at the mouth of the alley. Enzo went obediently, without resistance, but turned to look back at Brielle twice, as though his body didn't want to leave behind something his mind could no longer name. Cale stopped when they were almost at the vehicle, turned back to look at her, and asked only one question. "What's your name?" Brielle stood halfway down the alley from him, her arms folded across her chest against the cold, and answered, "Brielle." Cale nodded, didn't repeat her name, didn't thank her, didn't promise anything at all, only looked at her for 1 more second, and then turned away, helped his father into the SUV, closed the door, and the black vehicle rolled out of the alley in silence. Brielle remained there for a little while longer, watching the taillights fade and then disappear as the SUV turned the corner, and she realized that her heart was beating faster than usual, not from fear, but from something she couldn't quite define, maybe the strange feeling of being looked at for the first time in a very long while, with something other than pity, something other than indifference, something suspended somewhere between curiosity and respect. She walked home, climbed the dark stairs, stepped into the cold room, and sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the empty space on the table, where the old photograph had rested for an entire week. The photograph wasn't there anymore because she had returned it, but the emptiness it left behind made the room feel barer than before, as though the thing she had kept safe for the old man had quietly become part of this space without her realizing it until it was gone. She lay down, pulled the blanket over herself, closed her eyes, and thought about the man in the alley, the dark coat, the face like stone, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edges of the photograph. The way he had turned his face away for 1 second, as if afraid she might see something he didn't want anyone to see, and she wondered who he was, not his name, but what kind of man he was, the kind of man who arrived in a black SUV in the middle of the night within 20 minutes, with a driver waiting for him, and yet lifted his father to his feet with both hands and with a tenderness money can't buy. On the other side of the city, Cale sat beside his father's bed in the Moretti estate, Enzo's bedroom warm and softly lit, nothing like the freezing alley from which he had just been brought home. Enzo was asleep now, his breathing even, and curled beside him was Mabel, Cale's 5-year-old daughter, wrapped around her grandfather's arm with both tiny hands, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, sleeping with the absolute trust of a child who believes her grandfather will still be there when she wakes. Cale looked at the two of them, then lowered his gaze to the old photograph in his hand, the photograph his father had carried for so many years, even though he no longer remembered who the woman in it was. The photograph a strange girl had kept tucked close against her chest, in her coat pocket, for an entire week, carefully enough that it was only lightly wrinkled at one corner, not torn, not folded, as though she treated a stranger's keepsake, with a reverence many people don't give to their own belongings. He set the photograph on his father's bedside table beside the lamp, then stepped out into the hallway, where Priest was leaning against the wall, silent, waiting. Priest looked at Cale with the eyes of a man who had stayed beside him long enough to know when to ask and when to keep quiet. And tonight he chose to ask, "What are you going to do about her?" Cale stopped, didn't look at Priest, kept his eyes fixed on the door to his father's room where Mabel was sleeping, and answered, "I don't know yet." But that night, before he turned off the light in his study, Cale made a phone call to his accountant, his voice brief, offering no explanation, only an order. Pay the full outstanding hospital bill for patient Penny Ashford at St. Catherine Hospital as an anonymous charitable donation, with no name attached and no trace left behind. The next morning, Brielle arrived at St. Catherine Hospital before her shift, just as she always did, stepping through the glass doors of the pediatric wing with the practiced smile already set on her lips and 2 small cartons of milk, bought with the last coins left in her wallet. But before going up to the 3rd floor, she stopped at the billing office, because today was the final deadline, the day she had feared all week, the day she would have to face the collections clerk and say that she still didn't have the money but was begging for more time, the sentence she had rehearsed in her mind all night long, and still felt her throat close around every time she tried to say it aloud. She walked in, sat down in the waiting chair, gripped the strap of her bag tightly in her lap, and when her turn came, she stepped up to the counter, gave Penny Ashford's name, pediatric ward, 3rd floor, and braced herself to hear the number she already knew she couldn't pay. The billing clerk typed into the computer, looked at the screen, then looked back at Brielle with a faint expression of surprise, and said something Brielle had to ask her to repeat twice, because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Penny Ashford's hospital bill had been paid in full, an anonymous charitable donation, no sender's name, no contact information, processed the night before. Brielle sat there unable to speak, her hand still clenched around the strap of her bag, staring at the clerk as if waiting for her to say there had been a mistake, or that it was some kind of joke, but the woman said nothing more except, "Would you like a confirmation copy?" Brielle shook her head, stood up, and walked out of the billing office on legs that no longer felt like her own, stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and the entire way from the elevator to Penny's room she tried to understand what had just happened and couldn't, because 27 years of life had taught her that no one gives without taking something in return. No one helps without attaching conditions, and the world doesn't work in a way where her little sister's medical debt simply disappears overnight because of someone who leaves no name behind. She pushed open the hospital room door and found Penny propped up against her pillows, her thin hair loose over her shoulders, scribbling across the back of a hospital menu with the stub of a pencil a nurse had given her, and when she saw her sister, Penny looked up and smiled, the smile Brielle would trade anything in the world to see every single day. Brielle sat down on the edge of the bed and wrapped her arms around her, holding her more tightly than usual, and she hadn't meant to cry, but the tears came anyway, silent, falling into Penny's hair, and she couldn't explain because she didn't know where to begin. Penny didn't panic. She simply sat quietly in her sister's arms and waited, then asked in a small, gentle voice, calm in that strange way no 7-year-old should ever have to be, "Are you crying because you're happy or because you're sad?" Brielle wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, tried to smile, but her mouth trembled, and she answered, "Because I don't understand why someone would be kind to us." Penny tilted her head and looked at her sister with those big eyes that sometimes made Brielle feel they could see straight through everything grown-ups tried to hide. And then the child said, in a voice so soft it sounded like the simplest truth in the world, the kind only adults seem unable to notice, "Maybe it's because you were kind to them first, and you just don't remember." Brielle went still, looking at her little sister, and the words of that 7-year-old child fell into the center of her chest like a small stone dropped into a still lake, sending rings spreading outward that wouldn't stop. She didn't know how right Penny was. She didn't know that the night she sat on that freezing bench beside a lost old man was the night she had been kind to someone she didn't remember, and that person was now giving it back in a way she never could have imagined. She only knew that for the first time in a very long while, the weight on her shoulders lifted a little, not because of the money, but because of the feeling that somewhere out there, someone had seen her. 3 days after the hospital bill disappeared, Brielle still hadn't found an answer to the question of who had paid it, but she didn't have the luxury of thinking about it any longer, because life didn't allow her that kind of indulgence. She still had to wake at 5 in the morning, wash dishes until noon, rush over to the small cafe near the hospital to wait tables until evening, and then stop in to see Penny before walking home. That afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual because heavy snow was falling outside, and only a few customers were scattered here and there. Brielle was wiping down a table near the window when the bell above the door gave a soft chime. She looked up and stopped moving at once. Cale stepped inside, alone, without Priest, without a black SUV waiting outside, with only a dark coat dusted lightly with snow across his shoulders. And the first thing Brielle noticed was that he looked different when he wasn't standing in the darkness of an alley. Not more frightening and not gentler, only more real. A 36-year-old man with shadows beneath his eyes like someone who didn't sleep enough, and lines across his forehead like someone carrying too much and sharing it with no one. He sat down at the corner table, ordered black coffee, and waited. Brielle brought the coffee over, set it on the table, and was about to turn away, but Cale said, "Can you sit for a minute?" She looked around the cafe, saw that the manager wasn't there and the customers were few, then sat down in the chair across from him, not because he had asked, but because she also wanted to understand why this man was here. Cale didn't circle around the matter. He spoke plainly in a low, clear voice, like a man used to going straight to the point, because he didn't make a habit of wasting his own time, or anyone else's. His father needed a full-time caregiver. The people he had hired before had treated it like a job, and Enzo had sensed that, so he refused to cooperate. But the 2 times Enzo had been with her, he had responded differently. He had smiled, he had held her hand. He had been calm, and that was the kind of thing money couldn't buy. But it was the one thing Cale was willing to pay any price to give his father. He offered her a salary 5 times greater than her current income, including a place to live, and guaranteed that she would still have time to visit her sister every day. Brielle sat and listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. But inside her mind, the broken pieces were already beginning to fit together. And when Cale stopped speaking, she looked directly into his eyes and asked one question he clearly hadn't expected. "You paid my sister's hospital bill, didn't you?" Cale didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He only looked at her with that steady, expressionless gaze. But his silence was answer enough, and Brielle understood it immediately, because she had lived with lack long enough to know when someone was hiding kindness behind a cold face. She stood up, pushed the chair back into place, looked at him, and said in a calm but firm voice, the voice of someone who had refused enough things in life to know how to refuse without shaking, "I'm grateful to you for the hospital bill, but I don't sell gratitude. I helped your father because he needed help, not in exchange for a job or money. And if I say yes now, then everything I did that night turns into a transaction, and I don't want it to be a transaction." She turned away and walked back toward the counter, and Cale remained there, watching her, not calling after her, not adding another word, because he was intelligent enough to know that there are some things that can't be forced, and some people who are only lost the harder you push. He left money for the coffee on the table, stood up, and walked to the door. But before he left, he placed a small business card on the table, where she had been sitting. No name, no title, no logo, only a handwritten phone number, as though he had prepared for the possibility that she would refuse and wanted to leave behind exactly one thread, as thin as possible, enough for her to take hold of if she chose, but not enough to make her feel bound. Brielle looked at the card from behind the counter after he was gone, watched it lying there on the wooden table in the middle of the quiet cafe, and she didn't pick it up right away. She left it there through the rest of her shift. But when she locked up the cafe that night, she slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, the very place where Enzo's old photograph had once rested, and she didn't know why she kept it, only that throwing it away would also have been a decision she wasn't ready to make. 4 days after Brielle turned Cale down at the cafe, the head of pediatric medicine called her into a private office after visiting hours, closed the door, invited her to sit, and the way he asked her to sit before speaking was enough to let Brielle know this wasn't good news. The doctor explained in a slow, professional voice that still couldn't hide the gravity beneath it. Penny's heart condition was worsening faster than expected. She needed surgery within 2 months. It couldn't be delayed any longer, and if the surgery didn't happen, the window of opportunity would close forever. Then he spoke about the cost, a number so large that Brielle had to ask him to repeat it because she thought she had heard it wrong, but she hadn't heard it wrong. The number was many times larger than the anonymous hospital payment that had already been made, so large that even if she worked all 3 jobs at once for 10 years, it still wouldn't be enough, and insurance would cover only a small part of it. Brielle remained in the doctor's office for another 5 minutes after he left, staring at the cost estimate in her hand, while the words blurred, because her eyes had filled with tears. Then she folded the paper, slipped it into her pocket, wiped her eyes, and went to Penny's room with the smile she knew wouldn't fool her sister, and still wore because she didn't know what else to do. Penny was sitting up in bed, drawing on a sheet of paper with the stub of a pencil, and she looked up at her sister with eyes too large for her small face. But she didn't ask if Brielle was all right, because she had already learned that asking that question only made her sister try harder to smile. Instead, Penny asked something else, her voice gentle and calm, as though she were speaking about the weather and not about her own life. "The doctor told you, didn't he? About the surgery?" Brielle nodded and couldn't speak. Penny looked at her for a moment longer, then said, "If someone wants to help, let them. Not everyone who helps wants something." Those words struck Brielle for the second time that week, from the same child, with the same wisdom no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. And this time, they struck harder because Brielle knew Penny was right, knew that her pride couldn't save her sister, knew that refusing help while Penny needed surgery in order to live wasn't dignity at all, but selfishness. That night, Brielle went home, sat on her bed in the dark with the nameless card in her hand, and stared at it for a long time, staring at the handwritten number she had already memorized even though she had only looked at it a few times. Then she picked up her phone and dialed, and every digit felt heavy, like stepping through a door she knew she wouldn't be able to come back through as the same person once she crossed it. The phone rang 3 times. Then the familiar low voice answered, saying nothing, only waiting in silence. And Brielle realized that was how he answered calls, always making the other person speak first, always keeping control even through silence. She drew in a breath, her voice steady but trembling slightly at the end. "I'll take the job." Silence stretched for 2 seconds. Then Cale said, "Good." Brielle spoke again, faster this time, as though she were afraid that if she stopped, she might change her mind. "I have one condition. If at any point I don't feel safe, I leave immediately, no explanation, no notice, and you don't stop me." There was another second of silence. Then Cale replied, his voice no heavier and no softer, flat and still like water whose bottom she couldn't see. "Fair." She ended the call, set the phone down on the bed, looked up at the peeling ceiling, and wondered what door she had just opened, where it would lead, and whether she was strong enough to endure whatever was waiting for her on the other side. 2 days after the midnight phone call, Brielle stood in front of the gates of the Moretti estate, with a single backpack holding everything she owned in the world: 2 changes of clothes, 1 extra pair of shoes, a toothbrush, and the small photograph of Penny that she always kept in her wallet. The iron gate rose higher than her head, painted black, with 2 slow-turning cameras mounted on the pillars, and a man she had never seen before stood inside, an earpiece tucked against one ear, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe with a look that was neither unfriendly nor hostile, only measuring, the kind of look she had seen on the guards at the orphanage whenever strangers arrived. The gate opened automatically, after the man said something into his device, and Brielle stepped inside, every footfall on the stone path leading to the front door, making the survival instinct inside her cry out a little louder, because everything about this place told her it wasn't built for people like her. The estate was large, but not showy. Gray stone walls, tall windows, neatly trimmed trees, beautiful in a cold and deliberate way, like a person making a careful effort not to reveal a single emotion. She entered the code Priest had texted her that morning. The heavy door opened, and she stepped inside. The hallway was wide, the polished stone floor gleaming, the ceiling high, the furnishings sparse, with no family photographs on the walls, no flowers, no warm colors, everything arranged so perfectly that it felt lifeless, as though the people who lived here didn't want to leave any sign that they had ever been there at all. Brielle stood in the middle of that hallway, hearing the echo of her own footsteps on the stone, and thought that the house felt like a beautiful shell wrapped around emptiness, just like its owner. Then she heard another set of footsteps, slow, dragging across the floor, and Enzo appeared at the far end of the hallway, his eyes cloudy, his unsteady walk achingly familiar. But when he saw her, he stopped, his old eyes blinking, and something lit inside them. Not memory, but feeling. The feeling of safety. The feeling of something known, something Alzheimer's hadn't managed to erase even after it had erased almost everything else. Enzo walked toward her, faster than usual, both hands reaching out, and called to her in a trembling voice full of joy. "You're home. You're home." Brielle stood still. She didn't step back. She didn't correct him, because she understood at once that he was mistaking her for someone else, Perhaps the daughter-in-law he had lost, the woman in the old photograph, and she couldn't bring herself to shatter that moment with the truth. She took his hands, gave a small nod, and said, "Yes, I'm home." Enzo held on tightly, his eyes filling with tears, and led her toward the sitting room as though he were afraid she would vanish if he let go. Brielle helped him sit down just as she realized she was being watched. Not by Kael. By a pair of small, round, dark eyes peering at her through the crack of a nearby door. Mabel stood half hidden behind the wooden door, only half her face visible, her long black hair slightly tangled, one hand gripping the edge of the frame, wearing a simple cotton dress that had grown a little short, white socks on the cold stone floor, and she was looking at Brielle with the expression of a child who had lost her mother and no longer believed that anyone new entering the house would stay. Brielle saw the little girl and felt her heart tighten, not with pity, but with recognition, because those eyes were exactly the same eyes she herself had once turned through the crack of the dormitory door at the Greer orphanage whenever strangers came. Eyes that wanted to trust but were afraid to, wanted to come closer but were afraid of being left behind. Brielle didn't step toward her. She didn't wave. She didn't call Mabel out, because she knew that a frightened child needs space, not someone rushing in. She simply lowered herself to the floor right there, until she was at the child's eye level, slowly, without threat, then looked through the crack in the door and said softly, her voice warm but not too eager, just enough for Mabel to hear without feeling pressed. "That's a beautiful bracelet. Did you make it yourself?" Mabel looked down at the cheap plastic bracelet on her wrist, the kind of bracelet no one in this grand house had likely ever noticed or praised. Then she looked back at Brielle, and the corner of her mouth lifted, only slightly, so faint it was almost invisible, but it was a smile, the first smile she had given a stranger in a very long time. At the far end of the hallway, standing in the shadows where no one could see him, Kael had witnessed all of it, from the moment his father called Brielle home, to the moment his daughter let the edge of a smile touch her mouth through the crack in the door, and something inside his chest shifted, very slightly, like a sheet of ice taking on a thin fracture that no one could hear. But it had cracked all the same, and it would never mend back into what it had been before. On her second day in the Moretti estate, Brielle saw everything she had sensed from the very first moment she stepped through the gates. That morning, when she led Enzo out to the back garden so he could sit and breathe the cold air, because the doctor had said natural light was good for someone with Alzheimer's, she saw a priest passing through the hallway, his jacket sagging slightly to one side, and she knew immediately what caused that uneven weight, because she had grown up on the poor south side of Chicago, and she knew what the shape of a gun hidden under a coat looked like long before she had learned how to read. She didn't react. She didn't look a second time. She simply kept leading Enzo into the garden and talked to him about the weather, as though she hadn't just seen anything at all. At noon, when she went to get a warm towel for Enzo, she passed Kael's office at the far end of the first-floor hallway. The door shut, the electronic lock blinking red, and from inside came the muffled sound of a low voice whose words she couldn't make out, but whose tone she could hear clearly. The tone of a man giving orders, not having a conversation. That evening, after Enzo had fallen asleep and Mabel had been taken back to her room, Brielle sat in the room assigned to her on the second floor, a room clean and large, bigger than her entire studio apartment, with a wide bed, thick blankets, and heat, and yet she didn't feel warm because she was sitting beside the window, looking down into the front courtyard and watching a black car stop at the gate. Two men get out, walk quickly into the house with tight faces, then 15 minutes later come back out, get into the car, and leave in silence. Then another car arrived, then another, and every time the front door opened and closed again, Brielle counted one more reason to believe this house wasn't what it appeared to be on the surface, that the man who had hired her wasn't only a wealthy son worried about his aging father, but something else, something she still couldn't name, though her body had recognized it long before because her body had been taught to identify danger before her mind ever had the chance to analyze it. She opened her backpack and began folding her clothes back inside, slowly but with purpose, because she had told Kael that if she ever felt unsafe, she would leave, and now that was exactly how she felt. She was in a house where men carried guns, where doors locked with codes, where strangers came and went in the middle of the night, and she had a 7-year-old sister in the hospital whom she couldn't risk losing herself for, not to anything that might keep her from ever returning to Penny again. She was pulling the zipper closed on the backpack when she heard a knock at the door. Soft, very soft, low, Not at the height of an adult hand, but much lower, around her waist level, and she knew who was standing outside before she even opened it. Mabel was there, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, holding a small star-patterned pillow worn thin with use. Her wide eyes lifted toward Brielle, and she said in the voice Brielle recognized immediately as the voice of a child who had been waiting a very long time to gather the courage to speak. "Brie, can you tell me a story? I can't sleep." Brielle looked down at the little girl, at the bare feet on the cold floor, at the worn pillow clutched in her arms, at those eyes, and she saw herself, not as a metaphor, but truly saw herself, saw the 7-year-old child standing in the dormitory, at the Greer Foundation after lights out, clutching a pillow, too afraid to knock on anyone's door, because there had never been a door meant for her, never anyone to tell her a story, never anyone to say, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." She looked at the zipped backpack on the bed, then back at Mabel, and in that moment, every thought about danger, about guns, about locked doors, about black cars in the night, faded before one simple truth. A motherless child was standing at her door asking for a story, and Brielle Ashford wasn't the kind of person who could close the door on that child and walk away. She set the backpack on the floor, opened the door wider, sat down on the threshold, and patted the empty space beside her. Mabel sat down at once, pressing close against her, the little pillow wedged between them, and Brielle began to tell a story. The story of a small lost cat in a great city trying to find its way home, her voice soft, slow, even, the same voice she used every night when she told stories to Penny. Mabel listened, her eyes gradually growing heavy, her head leaning against Brielle's shoulder, her breathing slowly evening out, and the little girl fell asleep right there on the threshold, in the warmth of a woman she had met only the day before, and yet had somehow trusted enough to knock on in the middle of the night. At the far end of the second-floor hallway, Cale stood in the darkness with his back against the wall and his arms folded over his chest, and he had been standing there since the moment he heard Mabel knock. He listened to Brielle telling a story to his daughter, listened to that warm, patient, gentle voice in a way no amount of money could ever buy, and he stood there without moving until her voice slowly faded and silence returned. And even after the silence came back, he remained there for a long time, because he didn't want to walk away from the first moment in 2 years when this house had once again held the sound of someone telling his daughter a bedtime story. The days that followed moved in a strange double rhythm Brielle had never known before. Daylight and darkness, the same house and yet 2 different worlds laid over each other without ever truly blending. In the daytime, Brielle slowly turned the cold estate into a place with human voices, with warmth, with the small, ordinary things this house had been missing for a very long time. She brought Enzo out to the garden every morning and sat beside him on the wooden bench beneath the covered terrace, listening to him talk on the days when his mind was clear enough. Stories from when he was young, about the first time he met his wife in a bakery in Little Italy, about the way he had taken her hand and told her that one day he would build her the most beautiful house in Chicago, and his eyes would brighten while he spoke, even though he no longer remembered his wife's name, because his body still remembered the story even when his mind had forgotten the woman inside it. Mabel began coming out of her room more often, no longer hiding behind doors but sitting on the living room floor, drawing pictures with the box of crayons Brielle had bought for her with her first paycheck, bright, colorful drawings of stick figures, of houses, of the sun. And then one day the little girl drew 4 people standing side by side and pointed to each one in turn. "This is Grandpa, this is Daddy, this is Bri, this is me," and Brielle had to turn her face away for a second because her eyes burned. Cale began coming home earlier, not by much, only about an hour earlier, but enough to sit at the dinner table while Mabel was still awake, enough to hear his daughter tell him what she had drawn that day, enough for Brielle to see that beneath the cold shell, he was trying, awkwardly and slowly, but trying all the same. Some evenings Brielle made coffee for Cale and left it on his desk before he came home, a small habit that began on the 3rd day and that she couldn't even remember truly beginning, only that each morning the cup was always empty. But the nights were another story. At night, after Enzo was asleep, and Mabel was curled beneath her blanket, clutching her faded celestial treasure, the house seemed to shed one skin and grow another. One evening, Brielle went into the kitchen for water and saw Cale sitting at the dining table, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and she noticed the bruises across his knuckles, not the kind left by an accidental blow, but the bruises of a man who had struck something, or someone, many times. Cale realized she was looking, and he lowered his hand beneath the table, slowly, without explanation, without trying to hide it, only moving it out of her sight, as though that was the smallest courtesy he could offer. Brielle got her water and left without saying a word. On another night, she woke to a sound in the courtyard, pulled back the curtain, and looked down to see Priest and 2 other men dragging a third man toward a car. The man's head was bowed, his hands pinned behind his back, and even in the dim courtyard light, Brielle could see blood on his collar. Then the car door slammed shut, the vehicle drove away, and the yard returned to silence as though nothing had happened at all. Brielle stood by the window for a long time after that, one hand clenched tightly around the curtain, her heart beating fast, and she understood clearly now, no longer through instinct or suspicion, but truly understood what this house was and who Cale Moretti was. That evening, for the first time in many days, Brielle didn't leave a cup of coffee on Cale's desk. The next morning, Cale looked at the empty space on the desk, the place where every night before that a cup of coffee had been waiting for him. And he understood at once, without a word needing to be said, because the absence of that coffee spoke more loudly than any question Brielle could have asked. It told him that she had seen, that she knew, and that something between them had changed. But Brielle didn't leave. She stayed because of Mabel, because of Enzo, because Penny needed the surgery. But she also began doing what her survival instincts told her she had to do. She started looking for leverage, not to blackmail anyone, not to expose anyone, but to protect herself, so that if anything ever happened to her, if she disappeared or was threatened, she would have something in her hands to make sure Penny would remain safe. One night when Cale was away and Priest had gone with him, Brielle went downstairs to the first floor, stood in front of Cale's office door, and tried the code she had secretly watched Priest enter 2 days earlier. The door opened. She stepped inside, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes moving quickly over the desk, the file cabinets, the drawers. She didn't find anything definite, because Cale was too careful a man to leave anything dangerous where it could be easily found. But she took pictures of a few papers, a few numbers, a few names she didn't understand, but thought she might need later. She left the office, closed the door, returned to her room, and lay down with her heart pounding hard enough to feel as though it might break, not knowing that in the upper corner of the office ceiling, a small camera had recorded everything from the first second she walked in until the final second she stepped out. And the next morning, when Priest checked the camera system as part of his routine, he stopped at the footage from 2 o'clock in the morning, watched it, and then brought it to Cale. Cale watched in silence, his face unchanged, but his fingers stopped tapping on the desk. And he stared at Brielle on the screen, the girl searching through his office with shaking hands, and he wasn't angry, because he understood why she had done it. Understood that someone who has already lost everything will do anything to protect the last thing she has left, and the last thing Brielle had left was Penny. The confrontation came that evening, not because Cale initiated it, but because Brielle wasn't the kind of person who waited for a bomb to go off once she had already heard the ticking. She waited until Enzo was asleep, waited until Mabel had gone into her room, then went downstairs to the first floor, knocked on the door to Cale's study, and when he opened it, she stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Cale remained seated in his chair, looking at her as she stood across from his desk, her hands clenched tight at her sides, her back straight, her eyes fixed directly on his, and he understood at once that this wasn't the gentle girl who sat telling bedtime stories to his daughter. This was the girl who had survived an orphanage and the streets of Chicago. This was another version of Brielle, one he had never seen before, and perhaps one very few people had ever seen and still remained standing afterward. Brielle asked, her voice calm but hard as steel, "Has anyone been hurt because of you?" No circling around the point, no opening explanation of what she knew or had seen, just one question laid across the desk like a knife, and the way she asked it told Cale that she didn't need him to confirm anything, because she already knew the answer. She only needed to hear him say it out loud. Cale looked at her for a long moment, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, long enough to consider lying, long enough to decide not to, because he understood that with this woman, a lie would end everything faster than any truth ever could. He answered, "Yes." One word. No justification, no explanation, no story of cause or circumstance, only the admission in a single syllable that he was exactly what she believed him to be. Brielle nodded, the slightest nod, as though she were marking off the last box on a list of things she had long suspected. Then she turned, walked out of the room, went straight upstairs to the second floor, into her own room, and began opening her backpack. She folded her clothes, shoved them inside, pulled the zipper shut, every movement quick and precise with the ease of someone already used to leaving, already used to never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. She swung the backpack over her shoulder, opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and stopped. Mabel was standing there, right in front of her door, barefoot on the wooden floor, holding the well-worn fabric against her chest, her wide eyes lifting to the backpack on Brielle's shoulder, and those eyes understood immediately, without anyone explaining, because a 5-year-old child who had already lost her mother knows exactly what leaving looks like. Mabel ran to her, wrapped both tiny arms around Brielle's leg, pressed her face against her knee, and said in a voice choked and shattered, a voice no child should ever have to use, "Bri, don't go. Don't go like Mama. Mama left and didn't come back." Brielle froze in the middle of the hallway, the backpack on her shoulder, Mabel's arms clinging tightly to her leg, and those words struck her harder than any blow life had ever thrown, because they weren't only the plea of a child, they were the echo of her own voice, 20 years earlier, the little girl standing at the orphanage door watching her father's back walk away and never return. At the far end of the hall, Cale was standing there. He had followed Brielle upstairs because he knew she would leave, but he hadn't expected Mabel. He hadn't expected his daughter to run out, and now he stood there watching that scene with everything inside him shaken loose. Cale Moretti, the man the entire underworld called the Quiet Devil, felt fear for the first time in his life. Not fear of an enemy, not fear of death, but fear that his daughter would look at him with those eyes every day if he let Brielle walk out that door, fear that Mabel would lose one more person, and that this time it would shatter the last unbroken thing left inside her. Brielle slowly lowered the backpack to the floor, knelt down, gathered Mabel into her arms, and whispered against her ear, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here." Mabel cried without sound, only the trembling of her shoulders inside Brielle's embrace, and Brielle held her tighter and closed her eyes, because she knew she had just made a decision not with reason, but with something deeper, something no one had given her 20 years ago, and now she was giving it to this child. When Mabel had calmed down and Brielle had taken her back to her room and settled her into bed, Brielle returned to the hallway, looked at Cale still standing there, and said, her voice steady again now, but carrying the weight of someone who had just wagered everything, "I'm staying for Mabel and for Mr. Enzo, but I have one condition. Inside this house, there will be no violence. I don't need to know what you do outside, but within these 4 walls, where your daughter sleeps and your father lives, there will be no blood, no guns in plain sight, no men being dragged away in the middle of the night." Cale looked at her in silence, then said, his voice low and even, "You searched my office the other night. The camera recorded all of it." Brielle didn't deny it. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. She met his eyes and said, "Yes, I did it for Penny. If anything happens to me, I need to know my sister will still be safe. Wouldn't you do the same if you were in my place?" Cale was silent for a long time, because that question struck the one place he couldn't argue with. He would have done exactly the same, and probably worse, if Mabel had been in Penny's place. Then he nodded, a heavy nod. "Fair. I accept your condition." And the two of them stood there in the dark hallway, without shaking hands, without embracing, without grand promises, only 2 people who had seen the worst parts of each other and still chosen to remain standing side by side, knowing that the trust between them had limits, had fractures, had dark places neither of them would shine a light into. But it was enough for them to go on, enough so Mabel wouldn't lose one more person. And sometimes enough is all human beings need. But while Brielle and Cale were learning how to exist beside each other, within the fragile boundary they had just drawn, on the far side of the city, in a dark penthouse apartment on the top floor of an old building in West Loop, a 42-year-old man was sitting in front of 4 monitors, glowing a pale blue. And that man had been watching everything for a long time, before Brielle ever set foot inside the Moretti estate. Paxton Greer wasn't just an enemy. He was the invisible architect of the very hardships Brielle had spent her life trying to outrun. He was the kind of enemy you only realize has been there after everything around you has already fallen apart. 2 years earlier, he had been Cale's most trusted right hand, the only man who knew every password, every route, every weakness of the Moretti family, until Cale discovered that he was selling information to a rival faction, information that directly led to the ambush that killed Cale's wife on the road while she was on her way to pick Mabel up from school. Paxton survived because he disappeared in time, built his own faction with dirty money and old connections, and from then on he sat in the dark, patient, watching, waiting, like a spider that never hurries because it knows the prey can't escape the web already spun around it. He knew Enzo had wandered off. He knew Cale had gone to the hospital that night. He knew a strange girl had saved the old man. And since then he had men tracking every movement Cale made. Tonight, one of his men gave a report over the phone, his voice flat as he read from a file they had put together themselves. The girl had moved into the Moretti estate. Her name was Brielle Ashford, 27 years old, an orphan, formerly a resident of the Greer Foundation Center from the age of 22. Paxton had been drinking, but his hand stopped halfway to his mouth when he heard the words Greer Foundation. He set the glass down slowly, then opened an old file on his computer, one he had kept from the days when he still owned that orphanage, back when he used it both as a front for legitimate business and as a place to exploit orphan children for labor in sewing and packaging operations hidden in the basement. He scrolled through the list, hundreds of names, and stopped at Ashford, not Brielle, but her mother, the woman who had once come knocking at his door before she died, asking for a small loan to pay hospital bills, a debt never repaid because she collapsed in the street and died 2 days later, leaving behind a 12-year-old daughter who fell straight into the orphanage, owned by the very creditor her mother still owed money to. Paxton leaned back in his chair, his mouth curving into a smile that would have sent a chill through anyone who saw it. He murmured to the empty room, "She was always meant to return to my web. In this city, every path for the broken eventually leads back to me." He didn't rush to act because he never rushed. He simply began pulling the strings he had put in place long ago. The first move was Russ Tanner. Russ was the manager of the laundromat where Brielle had once worked, and he was also one of Paxton's debtors, carrying a gambling debt large enough to make him do anything Paxton asked, without daring to question why. Paxton called Russ, his voice as easy as if he were inviting a friend out for coffee, and asked him for one small favor. Find a way to run into Brielle, talk casually, but plant one seed of doubt in her mind. Russ did exactly as he was told. He happened to run into Brielle near Street Catherine Hospital when she came to visit Penny, his face arranged into a performance of regret, saying he was sorry he had fired her, offering her the job back, and when Brielle refused, Russ gave a light smile, patted her shoulder with false familiarity, and then said in a lowered voice, as though sharing a private secret between old acquaintances, "I hear you're working for rich people now. Be careful. Rich people are never kind for free. They always want something." Brielle didn't answer. She only looked at Russ with cold eyes and walked away, but the words lodged in her mind like a small thorn she couldn't pull out, because they touched the deepest fear she had carried with her since the orphanage, that no one is ever kind to her without a price, that every embrace can become a trap, and Russ didn't need to say another word because the seed had already been planted. Meanwhile, Paxton received a new photograph from the men watching the Moretti estate, a picture taken through the fence, slightly blurred but clear enough. Brielle was sitting in the garden, Mabel in her lap, the two of them looking at something in Mabel's hands while the little girl smiled. Paxton printed the photograph and placed it on his desk beside another one, showing Enzo walking in the garden, and he looked at those two images, with eyes from which human feeling had departed a very long time ago, leaving only cold calculation, and what he saw wasn't two people at all, but two vulnerabilities, two threads that, if pulled the right way, would bring Cale Moretti to his knees. Paxton didn't wait long. 3 days after the meeting between Russ and Brielle outside the hospital, he made his second move, and this time he didn't aim at Brielle. He aimed at the one thing that could break her from the inside out, Penny. That afternoon, Brielle arrived at St. Catherine Hospital after settling Enzo down for his afternoon nap and making sure Mabel was in the living room drawing under the watch of one of the housemaids. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor, turned into the familiar pediatric hallway, pushed open the door to Penny's room, and stopped right on the threshold. On the bedside table, beside the glass of water and Penny's box of worn-down pencils, sat a bouquet of fresh flowers, white flowers wrapped in elegant paper, the kind of flowers no one in Brielle's life had ever bought for her or for her sister. Tucked into the bouquet was a small white card, unsealed, already open. Brielle looked at the flowers and felt her stomach tighten at once, because she hadn't sent flowers, the hospital didn't send flowers, and no one in the world knew Penny was here except Brielle, except Cale, and except the person she still didn't know, the person who already knew far too much. She stepped forward, picked up the card, and read the neat handwriting on it. Just one sentence. But it was enough to knock the breath out of her faster than any blow ever could. Your sister is playing in a killer's house. Ask her. When Brielle finished reading, her hand shook so badly the card trembled between her fingers, and she turned to look at Penny, praying silently that she hadn't read it. But Penny was already sitting up against her pillows, her big eyes fixed directly on her sister, and the little girl asked in a voice so calm it made Brielle want to shatter right there where she stood. Brie, who is the killer? It wasn't the voice of a frightened child. It was the voice of a 7-year-old who had grown used to bad news, grown used to the world being unsafe, grown used to her sister hiding terrifying things behind a smile, and now she was asking plainly because she was tired of not knowing. Brielle set the card face down on the table, sat on the edge of the bed, gathered Penny into her arms, and said, "No one is a killer. Someone's just being cruel. That's all. Don't worry." But her voice wasn't steady enough, and Penny knew. Penny always knew. But this time, the little girl didn't ask another question. She only nodded against her sister's chest. Because this 7-year-old child had already learned that sometimes not asking is the only way to protect the person you love from having to lie. Brielle held her for one more minute, then gently eased Penny back down against the pillows, told her she was stepping outside to make a phone call, walked into the hallway, closed the hospital room door behind her, and leaned back against the wall, both hands shaking, her heart beating so fast she could hear the pulse in her ears. She pulled out her phone, dialed Cale's number, and Cale answered before the first ring ended. His presence felt even through the line as he waited for her to speak, her voice trembling but every word clear. "Someone knows about my sister. Someone got into her room. There were flowers and a card saying, 'I'm living in a killer's house.'" Silence stretched for 3 seconds, the heaviest 3 seconds Brielle had ever endured over a phone line, because in those 3 seconds she heard nothing. No breath, no movement, only that emptiness in which she imagined Cale's face changing in a way she had never seen. Then he said 2 words. 30 minutes. Exactly 30 minutes later, Priest stepped out of the elevator onto the 3rd floor of St. Catherine Hospital with 2 men Brielle had never seen before. All 3 wore dark clothes, moved quickly, and swept their eyes over every corner of the hallway. Priest spoke to the nurses' station in a voice no one dared argue with, demanding a list of every person who had entered or left the 3rd floor in the last 24 hours, demanding the hallway security footage, which revealed a bribed night shift orderly who had used a service entrance to slip the flowers in during the chaotic minutes of a staff rotation, demanding that no one be allowed into Penny's room except medical staff and Brielle. Brielle stood with her back against the hallway wall, watching Priest and the 2 men work, watching the head nurse nod again and again, with a strained look on her face, watching patients and family members in the corridor instinctively move aside whenever they passed, and she understood that what she was seeing wasn't ordinary security. It was power, the kind of power money alone can't buy, the kind that comes only through fear. And this was the first time she had seen the real world of Cale Moretti, not through a bedroom window at midnight, not through bruises on his hands, but right in front of her, in broad daylight, inside the hospital where her little sister lay. She called Orla, the only friend she had, and her voice shook as she spoke. "Orla, I can't explain right now, but I need you to know that if anything happens to me, Penny is in room 312, 3rd floor, St. Catherine." Orla was silent for a second and then asked, "What are you mixed up in, Bri?" And Brielle couldn't answer, because she didn't know either. She only knew that someone had reached Penny, and from this moment on, everything had changed. Cale arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the call, not because he had been slow, but because he had sat in the car for 10 minutes before getting out. 10 minutes, during which Priest remained in the driver's seat without speaking, because he knew Cale was putting everything back into order inside his own mind before facing Brielle. This time he couldn't hide behind silence anymore. He couldn't answer with a single yes and then say nothing else. He couldn't leave her to guess and then decide for herself whether to stay or go, because someone had reached her 7-year-old sister, and that changed every rule. He stepped onto the 3rd floor, past Priest and the 2 men standing guard at either end of the hallway, stopped in front of Penny's room, and looked through the small glass window in the door. Inside, Penny was asleep, so small in the white hospital bed, her thin hand resting on the blanket. And Cale looked at her, looked at the pale face, the fine hair, the lips slightly parted in sleep, and his jaw tightened so hard that the muscle in his temple flickered, because he saw Mabel in that child, saw the same fragility, the same smallness, and he understood why Brielle did everything she did. Understood it now not only with his mind as he had before, but with something deeper in his chest. Brielle stood a few steps away in the hallway, her back against the wall, her eyes red but dry, and when Kael turned to look at her, she spoke in a voice he had never heard from her before, not calm, not trembling, but the voice of someone who had run out of patience with not knowing. I need to know everything. Right now. No hiding, no leaving parts out, no protecting me by keeping things from me. Someone just walked into my sister's room, left flowers and a card calling you a killer, and I'm not taking one more step without knowing what I'm stepping into. Kael looked at her, weighed the last possible moment of hesitation, then nodded toward the waiting room at the end of the hall. They sat facing each other on 2 plastic hospital chairs under the pale white glare of fluorescent lights, and Kael told her. He told it plainly, without embellishment, without excuse, in the flat voice of a man reading out his own sentence. 2 years earlier, he had a right hand named Paxton Greer, the man he trusted most besides Priest, the man who knew every secret of the Moretti family, and Paxton sold information to a rival faction, information about routes, about timing, about the moments when their protection was thinnest. That information led to the ambush on the road, while Mabel was being picked up from school. Kael's wife was in the front seat, Mabel was in the back, and when the bullets came through the glass, his wife fell sideways, covering Mabel with her body, and that was the last thing she ever did in this world. Kael stopped there for a second, not because anything showed on the outside, but because something inside him tightened every time he had to drag this story into words. Then he continued. Paxton disappeared, built his own faction, and now he wanted to destroy everything Kael still cared about. Enzo, Mabel, and now Brielle. Then Kael added one more thing, something he knew would change everything. Paxton Greer. Before he worked for me, he was a predator who controlled the very infrastructure of survival for the poor, the laundromats, the debt-collecting clinics, and the orphanages. The orphanage where you grew up. Brielle said nothing. She sat there on the plastic hospital chair, and the world around her stopped. The name Greer Foundation didn't strike her like news. It struck her like a door blowing open into a room she had kept locked for 20 years, and memory poured out without asking permission. The fluorescent lights exactly like the lights above her now, the long hallway with the cold concrete floor, the shouting from the far end, her 12-year-old hands folding clothes from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, the crying of other children punished for working too slowly, and the face of the man she had never seen clearly but knew was the owner, knew was the man who decided what the children ate, where they slept, how much they worked, knew he was the reason she grew up with calloused hands and a sleep that was always ready to wake at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Brielle leaned back in the chair, her spine pressed into it, as if her body were trying to put distance between itself and what had just been spoken and couldn't, because it had already lived inside her for years. Kael looked at her and said, "You have the right to walk away. Right now. I'll still protect Penny. No conditions. I already had Priest place men outside her room after the flowers." Brielle sat still for a long time, looking down at the hospital floor, looking at her worn shoes. Then she lifted her head and looked straight into Kael's eyes, and her eyes were no longer shaking, no longer afraid. There was only something hard and bright left there. Something Kael recognized as the kind of thing no one can teach and no one can buy. Something that forms only when a human being has gone all the way to the bottom and decides not to stay there. She said, "I didn't run from Paxton Greer when I was 7 years old. I survived his orphanage. I survived the streets. I survived everything life threw at me. I'm not running now." That very night, after leaving the hospital, Kael summoned Priest into his study and began laying plans for a counterstrike against Paxton Greer. He sat behind his desk with a map of the area spread open, his phone on speaker, making short, clipped calls to names Brielle didn't know and didn't need to know, and he worked with the cold precision of a man who had waited 2 years for this chance, but no longer had the patience to wait any longer, because Paxton had touched what was never meant to be touched. Brielle wasn't in the room, but she knocked on the door close to 10 that night. Priest opened it, looked at her, then at Kael, and Kael gave a nod for her to come in. Brielle sat in the chair across from the desk and spoke in a calm, clear voice, the voice of someone who had decided where she stood. "Russ Tanner, the manager of the laundromat where I used to work." He ran into me near the hospital a few days ago, pretending it was by chance. But it wasn't by chance, because he knew I was at the hospital, knew what time I would be there, and he tried to plant the idea in my head that you couldn't be trusted." She paused for 1 second, then added, "I know Russ. He's not smart enough to come up with something like this on his own. He's a puppet. Someone is pulling him, and if Paxton Greer is the one behind it, then Russ is the thread connecting him to me, because Russ is always in debt. He always owes somebody something, and people can force him to do just about anything by using that debt." Cale looked at her, and for the first time he didn't look at her as someone who needed protection. He looked at her as an ally, as someone placing on the table the missing piece he needed, because he had a network. He had power. He had Priest. But he didn't have anyone inside the ordinary details of Brielle's daily life who would know small things like who Russ Tanner owed money to and why he showed up at the hospital at exactly that moment. Priest wrote Russ's name down, and Cale gave Brielle a nod, not a thank you in words because between them gratitude had become unnecessary. Only a nod that meant, "I hear you. I understand. I will use this." Brielle left the room, closed the door behind her, and went upstairs to check on Enzo before returning to her own room. He was sitting in the small upstairs sitting room, a light blanket around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the dark window, and Mabel was there beside him, holding a warm scarf she had just taken from the linen closet, carefully wrapping it around her grandfather's shoulders, slowly, gently, her tiny 5-year-old hands awkward but determined. And she was doing it without being asked, without being taught. She had simply seen that her grandfather was cold, and she was doing exactly what she had watched Brielle do every day. Brielle stood in the doorway, watching that scene, and she realized Mabel was repeating her gesture, the same gesture Brielle had made on the very first night at the bus stop bench when she wrapped a scarf around Enzo in the winter cold, and her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She only stood there and watched, because this was proof that kindness doesn't disappear when it is given away. It multiplies. It passes on into a 5-year-old child wrapping a scarf around her grandfather with all her little heart. At the far end of the hall, Cale had come upstairs to check on Mabel before returning to work, and he stopped walking when he saw what his daughter was doing, saw Brielle standing in the doorway watching his little girl, and in that moment, he understood with perfect clarity and sharpness that Mabel was learning how to love from Brielle. His daughter was being taught something he didn't know how to teach, something money can't buy, something bodyguards can't protect, and something he, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, had no ability to give her on his own. That night, when Cale returned to his study after midnight, his desk was no longer empty. There was a cup of coffee waiting there, still warm, set in the same place as before, at the right corner of the desk, near Mabel's picture, the place where it had been missing for so many days since the night Brielle saw Priest dragging a man away in the courtyard. Cale looked at the coffee, and he understood everything that cup was saying without a single word. She was staying, truly staying, not because Mabel had clung to her, not because Penny needed money, but because she had chosen to, because she had seen the darkness and still chosen to stand here. He sat down, picked up the cup, took one sip, then drank it all, and set the empty cup back on the desk. And in the dark house in the middle of the Chicago night, it was the longest and most honest conversation the two of them had ever had. Paxton made his move in the afternoon, at exactly the hour he knew the Moretti estate's protection was thinnest, because he had once been the man who designed that security schedule 2 years earlier, and he knew Cale hadn't completely changed the structure, only the people inside it. At 3 o'clock, Cale was out with Priest handling matters connected to the plan to strike back. 2 guards were stationed at the front gate. The backgrounds were covered only by cameras and 1 patrolman, and in the rear garden of the estate, beneath the wooden awning, Brielle was sitting with Enzo and Mabel. Enzo sat in his chair with a blanket over his shoulders, his gaze turned outward. It was one of his clear days, so he was telling Mabel about the first time he had ever seen snowfall when he was a child in Sicily. And Mabel sat in the grass at his feet, her head tipped up, her round eyes wide, listening with the complete devotion of a child who loves every second she is given with her grandfather. Brielle sat beside them, knitting a scarf for Penny from the skein of yarn Mabel had chosen in pink at the shop the week before, and in that moment everything felt so peaceful that she forgot the peace in this house was always something temporary. She heard the sound before she saw anyone, the fast crunch of footsteps on gravel coming from the side of the house, not the measured pace of the patrolman, because the patrolman moved slowly and evenly. These were running steps. several of them, and her instincts woke before her mind had time to understand. She sprang to her feet, the yarn falling into the grass, her eyes cutting left, and she saw 3 men in black rounding the corner of the house, moving quickly, with purpose, and one of them was heading straight for Enzo. Brielle didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She acted with the instinct that 27 years of survival had carved into her bones. She threw herself between Enzo and the man charging toward him, planted herself there with both arms spread wide, and she knew she couldn't win, knew she had no weapon, knew she was smaller and weaker than any of the 3 men. But her body refused to step aside, because behind her stood a 72-year-old man who no longer remembered who he was, and a 5-year-old girl too terrified even to breathe. The first man didn't stop. He drove Brielle aside with a hard blow to her shoulder and chest, and she heard something crack inside her body. Maybe a rib, maybe something else, and pain came at once, hot and vicious, shooting from her chest into her throat, but she didn't fall. She only staggered back 2 steps and caught herself again, because pain didn't matter now, only Mabel mattered. She turned and saw Mabel standing beside her grandfather's chair, frozen, her eyes stretched wide with horror, her mouth open but no sound coming out, and Brielle lunged for her, caught the little girl's shoulders in both hands, looked straight into Mabel's face, and shouted in a voice she didn't know she possessed, a voice sharp enough to tear through fear itself. "Run inside. Lock the door. Hit the red button." The red button was the emergency alarm Priest had shown Mabel ever since she was old enough to understand. The button the child had never pressed because she had never needed to, and in that instant the 5-year-old looked at Brielle with eyes swimming in tears, then turned and ran. Bare feet over the grass and then over the stone floor, into the house, down the hall, to the control panel beside the staircase, and her tiny hand slammed the red button. The alarm erupted, shrill and savage, ripping apart the quiet afternoon, and outside in the garden, Brielle felt one brief flash of relief, because Mabel had made it inside. She was safe, but that flash lasted less than a second, because the second blow came from behind, to the back of her neck, and the world tilted. She fell into the grass, her face striking the ground, the smell of wet earth and cold grass rushing into her nose, her ears ringing, but she could still hear Enzo, hear him crying out in panic and confusion, unable to understand what was happening because Alzheimer's had stolen that from him. And she tried to lift her head, tried to see. Her vision blurred, and she saw 2 of the men hauling Enzo up out of the chair, his resistance weak, his hand reaching toward Brielle as though trying to catch hold of her. And Brielle tried to reach back, tried to crawl toward him, but her body no longer obeyed, the pain in her chest spreading everywhere, her head heavy as poured lead. And the last thing she saw before darkness swallowed everything was Enzo's face, his eyes wide, frightened, bewildered, and his mouth calling out, not her name, but "My girl, where's my girl?" Because he had mistaken her for his dead daughter-in-law, and he believed his daughter-in-law was lying in the grass with no one helping her, and that image burned into Brielle's mind before she lost consciousness. She lay there on the cold grass, senseless, while the alarm still screamed through the estate, while Mabel sat curled inside her bedroom closet, with both hands over her ears, crying without sound, and while the vehicle carrying Enzo left the estate through the west service gate where the patrolman had already been taken out, Brielle had done the very thing survival should have taught her never to do. She had stood in front of danger for someone else instead of running. She had chosen to protect instead of save herself, and she had paid for that choice with her own body. But Mabel was safe, and in Brielle Ashford's world, that was enough. Cale received the call from the automatic alarm system while he was sitting in the car 20 minutes away from the estate, and Priest, who had stood beside him for more than 10 years, who had watched him receive the news of his wife's death and do nothing more than tighten his grip on the armrest before standing to give orders, later said that Cale's reaction in that moment was the most violent thing he had ever seen. Cale didn't shout, didn't smash anything, didn't lose control, but his entire body changed in a single second, as though something inside him had shut off and something else had switched on, something Priest named in his own mind as the version no one ever wanted to meet. Cale's eyes darkened, his jaw locked hard, his voice dropped one level lower than usual, and he gave orders in short, exact sentences that wasted not a single word. Home. Now. Priest drove through Chicago at a speed that made red lights irrelevant, and when they reached the estate, the gate was already open. The alarm had gone silent because the guards had handled it, and Cale stepped out of the car before it had fully stopped. He went straight inside, his eyes taking in everything in half a second. Saw the 2 front gate guards reporting to the security chief. Saw the signs of struggle in the hallway leading to the rear garden, and he asked only one question. "Mabel?" The guard answered, "Safe, in her bedroom." She hit the panic button. Cale went straight up to the 2nd floor, opened Mabel's bedroom door, and found his daughter sitting inside the closet. Curled up, both arms wrapped around her only source of comfort, her eyes red but no longer crying. He knelt down, pulled her out, held her tightly, and Mabel buried her face in his chest and whispered, "Bri told me to run inside. I hit the red button." "Daddy, where's Grandpa?" Cale didn't answer the last question. He only held her a moment longer, laid her on the bed, told the guard watching her not to take his eyes off her, and then he went downstairs to the back garden. Brielle was lying on the garden chaise beneath the terrace, while a private medic priest had called was bandaging her chest and head. Her face was pale, her lips dry, her eyes closed. But she was conscious. She had come around a few minutes before Cale arrived, and when she heard his footsteps on the wooden terrace floor, she opened her eyes. Cale sat down beside the chaise and looked at her face, looked at the bruise spreading across her temple, looked at the bandages wrapped around her ribs where the bone had cracked, and a cold fire flickered in his eyes, a look so lethal it made the air around them feel heavy. He asked, his voice low, controlled, but with something trembling underneath it, "Is Mabel all right?" And Brielle, lying there, pain all through her body, ribs cracked, head still spinning, made the first words out of her mouth not about herself, but still about the child. "I got her hidden in time. I told her to run inside and hit the red button. She's safe." Cale looked at her, and something in his eyes shifted, not softened because Cale Moretti didn't soften, but something deeper than that, something he had buried the day his wife used her body to shield Mabel in that ambushed car. Because now, for the 2nd time in his life, a woman had put herself in harm's way for his daughter. And this time it wasn't his wife, not someone bound by duty, but an orphaned girl he had hired to care for his aging father, and she had done it not from a mother's instinct, but from the instinct of someone who couldn't stand by and watch the vulnerable be harmed. Cale reached out and took Brielle's hand, the first time he had ever touched her, his hand large and warm around her small, freezing, weathered one, and he said, his voice breaking on the last 2 words, breaking in a way that made Priest turn his face away, because he had never heard Cale speak in that voice before. "You saved my daughter." Brielle closed her hand weakly around his, but she did, and she said, "Find Mr. Enzo. Russ Tanner. He once mentioned an old warehouse in Bridgeport when he was calling the laundromat workers about debts. He said that was where he met his creditor. If Paxton is using Russ, then maybe Paxton is using that place too." Cale looked at her, looked at the woman lying there wrapped in bandages with cracked ribs, who was still giving intelligence instead of crying or demanding a hospital. And then he stood, released her hand, turned to Priest, his eyes going dark again, his voice dropping again, that other version of him switching back on. "The Bridgeport warehouse. Find it, whatever it takes." Priest found the warehouse in Bridgeport within 2 hours, not because of luck, but because Brielle's information was so precise that it cut the search from days down to a single night. The warehouse stood at the end of an abandoned industrial alley near the canal, its red brick walls peeling, its iron door rusted, 2 vehicles parked outside, and Priest confirmed through his network that Russ Tanner had appeared there several times over the past month, enough to know this was the contact point between Russ and the man controlling him. Cale didn't wait until morning. He went to the warehouse with Priest and 6 men, and the rescue unfolded quickly and efficiently in the way only men who had done this kind of thing hundreds of times could manage. No chaos, no wasted gunfire, each man knowing his place and doing exactly what needed to be done. The 3 men Paxton had stationed to guard the warehouse were neutralized in less than 3 minutes, and when Cale stepped through the iron door, he saw his father sitting on a wooden chair in the corner, his hands loosely bound with plastic ties, his eyes open but seeing nothing because he was deep inside the panic Alzheimer's creates when the brain can no longer process too much at once. Enzo was trembling, his lips moving soundlessly, and his eyes watched Cale approach without recognizing his own son, and that hurt more than any physical wound Cale had ever taken. He knelt, cut the ties, took his father's hand, and said softly, "Father, it's me. I'm taking you home." Enzo didn't respond. His eyes were still wild, and his hand gripped Cale's, but it was the grip of a frightened man clutching a stranger. No recognition in it at all, only the instinct to hold on to anyone who felt safe. And Cale understood that this kidnapping had pushed his father's Alzheimer's one step farther down a road that would never turn back. He lifted his father into his arms, and Enzo was so light that it nearly choked him, because he was too light now, too frail. And Cale carried him to the car, settled him inside, wrapped him in a blanket, and then went back into the warehouse. Paxton Greer was tied to the chair Enzo had occupied only minutes earlier, Priest standing behind him, and Paxton watched Cale walk in with the look of a man in whom fear and arrogance were fighting for control. He knew he had lost, but he wasn't the kind of man who begged. He was the kind of man who smiled when he knew he was about to die, because he believed the last smile was still a kind of power. Cale pulled up a chair and sat down less than a yard away from him, looking straight into the eyes of the man who had once been his most trusted right hand. The silence stretched, heavy and dense, like the air before a storm, and then Cale spoke in a low, even voice. No rise, no fall. The voice of a man who had waited 2 years to say these words. 2 years ago, my wife. It was you. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Paxton looked at Cale, and the smile slowly disappeared from his mouth, not because he was afraid, but because he realized there was no point in pretending any longer, and he answered with silence. The silence that doesn't deny, the silence that confesses without ever opening its mouth. Cale sat there for 10 more seconds, looking at the face of the man who had killed his wife, kidnapped his father, threatened Brielle's 7-year-old sister, and driven his daughter into a closet with her hands over her ears, crying in silence. And in those 10 seconds, everything inside Cale demanded that he end it right there with his own hands. But he didn't, because Cale Moretti wasn't the kind of man who lost control. He was the kind of man who made a decision and then carried it out with a coldness that was more terrifying than rage could ever be. He stood, pushed the chair back, walked toward the door, and said to Priest without turning around, "It's over." 2 words. Priest nodded. Cale stepped outside, pulled the iron door shut behind him, and never once looked back into that room again. That same night, Russ Tanner was found in his filthy apartment on the south side, shaking, his face gone pale, because he had heard Paxton had been taken, and he knew he was the next thread to be pulled. He didn't need much pressure. He confessed everything before Priest could finish asking his second question. He had followed Brielle on Paxton's orders. He had approached her near the hospital using the script Paxton gave him. He had passed Brielle's schedule along to Paxton's men, and the bouquet in Penny's room had also been his doing, delivered by a bribed janitor who wasn't on Cale's payroll, because he knew the name of the hospital and the room number from the days when Brielle still worked at the laundromat and used to call the hospital during her breaks. Russ cried. Russ begged. And Russ disappeared from Chicago before dawn, how and where being the kind of thing Brielle would never ask and Cale would never tell. A month had passed since the night at the Bridgeport warehouse, and the Moretti estate no longer felt like the house Brielle had entered for the first time. Not because the walls had been repainted or the furniture had changed, but because the sounds inside it had changed. There was laughter now. There were the quick footsteps of a child running across the floor. There was the sound of a voice calling, "Bree," from the living room all the way out to the back garden. And that sound was something no money could buy and no power could force into being. It only came when someone truly wanted to stay. Penny's surgery had been successful 3 weeks earlier. Cale had paid every cent without Brielle ever needing to ask, and now the 7-year-old girl, with the thin scar across her chest, was sitting in the back garden on the green grass beside Mabel. The 2 children were drawing with colored chalk on the small blackboard Brielle had bought for them, and their laughter moved through the late afternoon air like music this house had never heard before. Penny grew stronger every day. There was a little color in her cheeks now. Her eyes were brighter. She could run, even though the doctor had told her to run slowly. But what 7-year-old child ever listens to that when she has a friend her own age to play with? And Mabel, the little girl who once hid behind doors and didn't dare look at anyone, was now teaching Penny how to draw stars on the board with the solemn voice of a 5-year-old teacher. Every time Penny finished drawing a star, Mabel clapped for her, and then the 2 of them laughed, and Brielle stood on the terrace looking down at them, her eyes warm but also sad, because not everything in this house was healing. Brielle hadn't forgotten the only person who stayed by her side when she had nothing. She had invited Orla to the estate for tea, finally answering the question from that frantic night by showing her friend that the shadows were gone, and they were both, at last, safe. Enzo was worse. The kidnapping had pushed the Alzheimer's into another stage the doctors said couldn't be reversed. He no longer recognized Cale. Sometimes he looked at his own son with the polite, distant gaze a man gives to a stranger. And every time that happened, Cale had to turn his face away, step out into the hallway, and stand there with his fists clenched so hard his knuckles went white before he could walk back in, because he wouldn't allow his father to see him hurting, even if his father no longer knew who he was. But whenever Brielle sat beside Enzo, holding his hand, speaking softly or simply sitting in silence with him, he smiled. His body remembered her even when his mind had forgotten her name. It remembered safety. It remembered the warmth of her hand. It remembered something deeper than names and memory, something Alzheimer's erases last because it lives in the deepest part of a human being. He still kept the old photograph in his hand, the picture of his late wife, the woman he no longer remembered and yet never released. And one afternoon, when Brielle sat beside him on the terrace, watching his trembling fingers stroke the photograph, she said to Cale, who was leaning in the doorway behind them, "He doesn't remember her name, but he remembers loving her. And maybe that's the most important thing a person can have." Cale didn't answer right away. He looked at his father, at the photograph in his father's hand, then at Brielle, and he nodded, slowly, heavily, the nod of a man learning to accept that there are things he can't control, can't buy, can't command, and that his father's love for the woman he had married, even with Alzheimer's erasing everything else, was proof that something inside a human being is stronger than forgetting. Cale still hadn't left the underworld. He knew he couldn't, not yet, and perhaps never would, because an empire doesn't sustain itself, and new enemies will always come. But inside this house, he kept his promise to Brielle. No violence, no guns in sight, no men dragged away in the night. And now Priest rearranged the schedule, so that every kind of business happened far from the four walls where Mabel and Enzo lived. That evening, after Penny and Mabel had been brought inside for dinner, Brielle and Cale stood on the terrace, shoulder to shoulder but not touching, watching the back garden change color in the late sunset, and Cale said, without looking at her, in a low, quiet voice that only she ever heard from him, "Do you know why I trust you?" Brielle shook her head. "Because both times you stopped for my father, you didn't know who I was. All my life, people have done things because they knew who I was. They were afraid. They wanted something. They were calculating. You're the first person who ever did something simply because it was right. Not because of me. Not because of money. Not because of fear. Just because you saw an old man freezing and couldn't walk away." Brielle looked toward the glass doors where the shadows of the two children moved at the dinner table inside, then looked down at her own hands still cracked, still rough, but warm now, and she said softly, "I didn't save him. He saved me. Because that night, if I hadn't stopped at that bench, I would have gone home alone, laid down in that dark room, and I don't know how many more nights I could have survived before everything fell apart. Because of him, I got here. Because of him, Penny had her surgery. Because of him, I met Mabel. And because of him, I met you." The last sentence came out softer than the others, soft enough that the evening wind almost carried it away. But Cale heard it. He heard every word, and he turned to look at her, the first time he had looked at her without hiding, without putting on the cold mask, without analyzing, only looking, with the eyes of a 36-year-old man who had lost too much and was afraid of losing more, but also afraid of never having anything again. The distance between them narrowed by less than a step, not because either of them moved, but because something invisible between them had drawn inward, had become denser, warmer. There was no kiss, no declaration, no grand promise. Both of them had been taught by life that the grand promises are usually the first things to break. There were only two people standing beside each other on a terrace while the sky darkened. Two people life had broken more than once and who were still standing, and for the first time, neither of them felt as though they were standing alone anymore. The story of the Devil's Mercy ends here. But before we say goodbye, there is one thing this story wants to leave with all of you who have been listening. Kindness never disappears when you give it away. It multiplies. It spreads into the people around you. It reaches places you never expected. Just as Brielle only sat down beside an old man on a bench, without knowing that moment would change her entire life, and just as Mabel learned how to love, simply by watching Brielle wrap a scarf around her grandfather. In real life, we meet moments like that every day. Moments when someone needs help, and we have to choose whether to keep walking or to stop. And every time we choose to stop, we may not only be saving someone else, we may also be saving ourselves in a way we never could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day. Please like this video and share it with the people you love, because sometimes a good story can brighten someone's entire day. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. How did this story make you feel? Which character touched you the most? And in real life, have you ever experienced a moment when one small act of kindness changed everything? Please share in the comments below. We read every comment, and we always listen to the stories that come from the deepest places in your hearts. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.